Now we are blessed with a second very prominent speaker, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who is director of a very important, one of the most important social and political think tanks in India.
I'll be brief because I think it'd be nice to have more discussion on these issues. And in a sense, what I'll do is sort of structure my remarks as a kind of follow-up on Ashishda's talk. A couple of preliminary points. I mean, you know, in a way, I think one of the things I do share with Ashishda is this worry about the idolatry of collective subjects that comes up in different ideologies, whether Marxism or nationalism and so forth. And I think that if there is one thing that does put him in the liberal camp in the right sense, it is a suspicion of the idolatry of collective pronouns. One has to always be suspicious of. A second preliminary remark before I make 2 or 3 comments on the secular religious distinction, which is the theme of this panel, is I must confess to a sense of real intellectual vertigo whenever I go to any discussions of secularism or religion, particularly in academic contexts. All the words we use, liberal, secular, fundamentalists, are ideologically charged, semantically overladen, often indeterminate, and you often get the sense that the purpose of these discussions is cutting up something rather than really understanding. And it's very hard to have a conversation on these subjects where you don't fall into the same traps over and over again. So when I looked at the title of this panel, you know, liberal secularists, alter ego of religious fundamentalists, I came to the conclusion, yes, but probably for not the reason that many of my co-panelists would suggest, which is that neither of those categories exists. At least certainly not in India. And I'd like to spend a couple of minutes explaining why I think that is the case. Let's start with one end of that, religious fundamentalists, religion. Of course, in the presence of all the people here, particularly Professor Vergelijkende, one doesn't have to sort of, you know, belabor the point about it's not clear that the divide between religion and secular is a self-evident distinction in any sense. And if one were to put the point in a summary form, in a way you could argue that the distinction between religion and secular arises or becomes in a sense politically interesting only in the context of the rise of sovereign power. Which if you ask the question, who is it that makes the distinction between religious and secular, I think Hobbes was absolutely right. That's a distinction that is itself internal to the exercise of sovereignty in state. And you cannot escape our metaphors of talking about this. You know, there's a distinction between church and state. Who polices the boundaries? The state. So the real question is, in a sense, how does this distinction arise in the context of the elaboration of sovereign power in any given society? And that's where I think the histories of Europe and India are actually conjoined. I mean, I don't think the distinction turns on they have a different concept of sovereignty or we have a different concept of sovereignty at all. And so the question is not then what makes something religious, what is religious. We can keep going around in circles on that question. The question is what is at stake in defining something as religious. You know, often it's invoked to resist the encroachment of sovereignty or to create an alternative locus of authority. So in that sense, religious fundamentalism, not sure what's at issue there. Let's in a sense deepen this conundrum of religion. So one, it's a distinction internal to the exercise of sovereignty. Second, if you ask the kind of Humean question, in what social practices does a specifically embodied, right? Particularly in the context where the world becomes desacralized, right? So if you're in a sense you're a believer, you losing the term loosely. So we aren't saying let's structure the world according to the Hindu division of labor. We aren't saying let's structure interest rates according to Hindu interest rates, although in some contexts that is probably still a relevant category. We aren't saying let's distribute political power according to some sort of textually given or canonical religious interpretation of that. So where is religion going to be embodied? Private belief, private ritual, some vague space called civil society, right? The point is, in a sense, the old Weberian point, which is that religion's ability to fashion an unbroken totality of social experience is pretty much gone, dead. We have to live with it. We can't lament. It's not a question of decisionism that, can we reinvent the sacral world, right? That is a sociological reality of our time. And in that sense, to that extent, religion will be alienated from the world. And the question is not so much the fact of that alienation, the question is how do we, in a sense, existentially manage that alienation, the fact that the world is not an unbroken totality for us in different senses. The third context in the evisceration of religion that Professor Nandi talked about is, of course, the ethnicization of religion. Right? Religion as simply a collective pronoun and identity, Hindu, whatever that means, disjointed from any particular set of beliefs or practices. Now, the issue about this ethnicization is that it's not simply an ideological choice, a la Savarkar, Hindu as a kind of racial category. That ethnicization seems to be, in a sense, created by broader sociological causes. It's happening to all religions, in a sense. And we are often very ambiguous about, can you really escape being a Muslim? Can you really escape being a Hindu? What does that mean? So that alignment of religion and identity, again, it's not clear where that leaves religion. Finally, I think the crisis that is internal to religious knowledge itself. One crisis is, of course, if you like, the relationship between religion and the world, and we can argue when exactly that crisis arose. Is it a problem of modernity, or is it very much enshrined in the logic of religious thinking itself, where the connection between eschatology, soteriology, forms of social existence, has never been, in a sense, clear. But I think in the Indian context in particular, since we were discussing Hindutva, I think there is an issue, which is there are certainly certain forms of religious practices that Professor Nandi talked about, that come out of the Purans and so forth, that are very vibrant. Although I would question his distinction between the local and the sort of broader construction of them, or the relationship between local practice and textual. I think it's a lot more complicated than this simple dichotomy. But the simple fact is, whenever we are looking at this body of materials, Vedas, Upanishads, whichever text you want, Puranas, if you want to think texts of yoga, religious texts, the simple fact is, we have no clue, most of us, how to begin to understand them. Most of what passes off as writing for them is, when I was telling this to Professor Balagangadhar, is a bit like people trying to do philosophy of science with fragments of philosophy of science texts without having any clue of what it is the reality that they are referring to. Right? Experience, anubhav, is the central concept, shraddha. Now, the central concept, about something about, in a sense, the way in which you receive the world of this tradition. That has disappeared. It survives in pockets, but even in traditional religious marts, that's disappeared. They've gone into a kind of textual defensiveness about that tradition. So this is really Alistair McIntyre's nightmare scenario, that disquieting suggestion in the beginning of After Virtue. Imagine trying to reconstruct a whole universe out of these little fragments, and almost all of our arguments. In fact, almost entire. Why I find the academic study of Hinduism, in some senses, sort of beside the point often, is because you have the sense of trying to construct a reality out of broken fragments of meta-order texts, and where you have no sense of the access to that experience. So how can you have, religion is all gone. It's done.